From FingerLakes1.com, this is The Debrief. I'm Josh Durso, and this week, Jackie Augustine and I dove into recent headlines about industrial development agencies and how they function. There's a lot of confusion out there about what they do or don't do, and what rules or standards they're held to. We talk about that, the criticisms doled out about them, as well as the nuts and bolts of what make them a required step in the whole economic development process in New York. We also dive into a fascinating local story out of Cayuga County about a town board there requiring residents to sign in order to attend public meetings. A local journalist was removed from a town board meeting there because he refused to do so. And instead of denying the allegation, in a move that surprised both of us, the town doubled down, saying sign-in sheets are necessary to keep elected officials and others safe. Before we get into those, though, a big welcome to our new listeners over on WGCC, Geneva Community Radio. FingerLakes1.com is proud to be launching a new partnership with WGCC, which will bring a lot of our content to their airwaves. So if you're listening from Geneva, we are glad to have you here and hope you stay. If you'd like to join the conversation, as we always tell everyone, you can email us at debrief@fingerlakes1.com or leave a comment on our Substack. The website there is debriefpod.substack.com. Now, episode 236 of The Debrief. All right, Jackie, let's start with your column today in the Finger Lakes Times. This week you wrote about IDAs, and there's been plenty of debate about them in Geneva. I felt like there was a little more you wanted to say, or maybe more to talk about. So walk us through what you were thinking. I wanted to give you a little space here at the start to just talk us through what you wrote, and we'll see where it takes us.
The dialogue at some of the city council meetings and in the community as we see the Dunkin' Donuts on North Exchange Street start to take shape, literally. And people are asking questions about some of the IDA's projects that have not moved forward or who might be coming back to the table for additional incentives. And then most recently, you had a city councilor, Jamie Kame, who was questioning whether the county really gives us any attention at all when it comes to economic development, and particularly industrial development. So I thought it was helpful to just remind people that the Industrial Development Agency has industry in the name and has really, I think, Guardian Glass, when its pilot got renegotiated by the IDA a couple of years ago after being purchased by Koch Industries. I don't know that it's been front and center in people's minds in terms of industrial development. So there are some really excellent reports from the state comptroller's office about what works well and what doesn't work so well with IDAs. And I think what we see is the IDA functions quite differently at the county level, where it does seem to be focused more on industry and business development than at the city level, where it seems to be just a vehicle for tax exemptions. And I think if I sound a little critical of that, it's because I am.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things that really stands out to me is the challenge that exists, I think, in a place like Geneva, where you have a local IDA as well as a county IDA, a really challenging thing to navigate. Philosophically, I think I wish they didn't have to exist. I wish IDAs weren't necessary, but looking at how economic development works and how things come to pass in New York State, it's just an embedded part of the system. So the system probably should be reformed at the state level, but it's complicated because I go back to my days covering county boards, whether it was the Seneca County Board of Supervisors, the Ontario County Board of Supervisors, Yates County Legislature, back 10-ish years ago. And There were always criticisms of IDAs and how they worked, but they exist because they have to, basically. Like, I guess where I start to part with people who just oppose the idea of an IDA without saying the state needs to first act in a significant way is that it misses the reality that without IDAs getting involved, financing projects by developers just wouldn't really be feasible in most cases. You'd still have some development, but you wouldn't have much. And the other thing, and I think you made a really good point of emphasizing this in your column, industrial development or economic development in general now is actually housing. It isn't really industrial development at all. And without houses that people can afford, your workforce is not going to be substantial enough to attract employers. And it's just all part of the same problem. It's interesting because IDAs are really complicated, but for the most part, fly under the radar of the average taxpayer. It might be almost as confusing a topic for a lot of people as assessments, which we've talked a lot about.
Well, I mean, they often go hand in hand, right? People are upset about their assessments. They're really upset about the property tax levy and rate. And IDAs and pilot agreements go hand in hand with how those levies and rates come to be. And, I just think there is, like you were saying, I totally agree. There's kind of the philosophical question, and I'm not completely opposed to IDAs. I do think economic development incentives are important and necessary, but they are supposed to be incentives. They are not supposed to be the general operating procedure for all development, because if it is, that is a symptom of something really wrong with your municipal, county, state finances that would require an abatement. I mean, what you're saying is let's go outside of how the normal government structure is supposed to function and do this differently. But that's what we need. I'm saying, I'm sorry, we need those projects. We need housing projects. So if they can't exist within the existing structure, something's wrong with the structure. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to give IDAs a completely bad name. I do think there is a legitimate purpose. I wish that they did more clawback provisions, which they're empowered to do, so that when we see these projects not adhere to the timeline, not adhere to the initial scope, and maybe not get built at all, that there would be some municipal recourse for those things.
Admittedly, it's really hard to imagine what that would even look like because they have become so central. Like you said, they're involved in essentially every single economic development project that happens over a certain threshold. And some small economic development projects that don't involve the IDA, but and this is every single county across New York State. It's interesting because it's hard to imagine what that structure looks like. Have you given that any thought, like what a structure would look like? Like what guide rails would you put on how IDAs work in order to make them better?
I think training for the members is important. I think we're seeing that across all kind of municipal boards and commissions. Training is critical. I think knowing how to work with and I don't want to use the word interrogate, but evaluate a developer and the plans and the feasibility, to be able to look at a jobs report and really tease out what are the construction jobs that are temporary, that are you know being claimed as full-time equivalent, created jobs that are really just a transient short-term effort, and what's actually going to happen. And maybe taking a look at how some of the incentives, like the sales and mortgage recording taxes, could actually assist small businesses, existing businesses, in a way that, I mean, that's economic development, right? Economic development occurs in what what people might not notice, which is the everyday small business development versus just the big ticket factory project, which again, we've seen you bring in a large mega store, and then you see your smaller businesses go out of business, and the same people who were advocating for tax abatements for a mega store are then upset that their small, locally owned businesses have closed. And I think, again, you just need a bit more training, and education around some of these serious economic conditions before people are making decisions that greatly impact that landscape.
Does Okay, so when I hear you say that though, I also think about the fact that that is I think that's the same argument for why the conditions that are being created at the state level, whether it's regulatory, whether it's the taxing structure on new business, whatever the case may be, is also the argument for why there needs to be like a fundamental overhaul of everything that doesn't directly connect to um, the IDA operation itself. So one of the things that I was thinking about is there's always, this big business versus small business competition, I guess, in economic development. And something that I keep coming back to is the idea that the state, in terms of a solution, we see IDAs focus on the big companies, right? They want to get the big wins. The state could probably do a handful of things to make it easier for really small companies and businesses start more easily without having to jump through 750 regulatory hoops before they're able to actually, because at the end of the day, the friction that they face isn't all that different than the larger companies have to deal with, except the larger companies have all the resources to actually be able to get through the mumbo jumbo that they have to get through. And stuff like that seems like the easiest, most low hanging fruit that lawmakers in Albany could be just tackling every single legislative session, chipping away at a couple more things, making the environment across the whole state. It doesn't matter what county you're in or what town you're in, make it easier for a very small business to open, operate, stay in operation for those first, 12 to 36 months. We always hear about how important the first year or first 2 years are for small businesses. Make it easier for them under those circumstances and continue to apply the regulatory hurdles that have made it difficult for people to do business in New York State. Apply those to the big dogs. Does that sound like
Yeah, yeah,
semi-logical, or is that hopelessly
no.
optimistic on my part?
Well, it might be. I mean, it is optimistic, right? We're optimists. But I do think that, retention incentives, I think, would be a really great place that we could potentially start with this. Because when you think about it, a 30-year a 30-year property tax deal is a retention incentive for a large industry that, in theory, should be penciling out and in the black well before they get to that 30 years. If not, there's something wrong with the business model, right? But
Right.
smaller
Yeah.
retention incentives to small businesses would recognize, I mean, it's a question of priorities, right? You put your money where your priorities are. And what I see in regional and local economic development is we put our money and energy toward trying to get these big things that we think are going to save us, and we're totally missing the point. I won't say we're totally missing the point, right? There are some wins, but it too much. I think there's too much effort. And again, you see the city council talking about, we want industry here, we want factories here. And I'm thinking, do you? Because think about the types of communities that are factory communities, and think about the types of communities that have thriving small businesses. How about we put our energy into small business development in that way, and housing, right? How many studies have told us small businesses or large industries that employ people, you have to have the housing to support it, which you said at the outset. And I just want to circle back to, because the people making decisions haven't internalized the data and the reality, the economic realities of what is going to get them to where they say they want to be.
Yeah, it's interesting because at this point, the system just feels very old, whether you're talking about approach to small business or large industrial development like you just described. And surely there's an opportunity to make some improvements there quickly. But let's shift gears here a little bit and talk about what I think might be one of the most interesting local government stories I've seen in a long time. A local journalist with Green Gator News says he was removed from a Ment's town board meeting after refusing to sign an attendance sheet. The incident sparked debate on on Facebook over New York's open meetings law, and also guidance from the state's Committee on Open Government that sign-in sheets are generally not required as a condition of attendance. But that didn't change anything because town officials didn't deny it. And actually, they doubled down saying that the measure was taken and is continuing to be taken due to security concerns. For those listening outside of the immediate area, the town of Mentz is located in Cayuga County. Jackie, when you first read that, I'm curious what you thought.
My first thought was, where's the town of Mentz, which I looked up.
Yeah.
And yeah, you know, I do believe in radically public meetings. I do think government is supposed to happen in front of people, right? It's supposed to happen in open air, in plain sight, in the sunshine, because that's what makes government better. I guess I can understand wanting to know. I can understand some security concern in this day and age, like wanting to know who's coming in for a meeting, but I think that's a matter of screening. I don't know that it's so much an identity question as it is just a screening question, right? Like there's the question of whether you have to go through a metal detector, those kinds of things. But to require, if someone's uncomfortable filling out a sign-in sheet, um, yeah, I mean, that is really a hard case because I don't agree you should have to sign up to be able to speak. I think the podium should be open. I don't necessarily think you should be limited to 3
Yeah.
minutes, which is very short. I don't think you should only be allowed to speak once. Different organizations have different rules, but the sign-in sheet seemed extreme to me, and not allowing someone to attend for refusing to sign in seemed like an open meetings violation.
Yeah, to me, it's just wild because the metal detector, if we're going to use that as the line in the sand, I know there's some criticism of that. I've heard criticism of that in other communities. If that's the line in the sand, this is like well beyond that from my perspective, because I think given the realities of what people see government doing every day, how they see it operating, um, I think there's an understandable amount of hesitation to attach oneself publicly in that way to government meetings. But does that mean a person, especially a journalist, shouldn't be able to attend? That to me is like a really strange place to be. But after I read it and I was scrolling through Facebook and I saw, I believe it was the town supervisor, double down and say, "Yeah, we do this, and it's a security concern, and we don't really care what what the documentation at the state level says. This is what we do." It just reminded me of how often we have these situations where there isn't any consequence. Like, there are rules against it. And, so many of the rules that we have that govern our government are just the honor system. And without any enforcement, there isn't any way for the state to enforce this rule or this violation against the town of Mentz. So, you're left in this scenario where I think by and large, it just fuels distrust
Yes.
within the population of that governing body. And another important point, I think, they made no fans by doing this, and it was one of the most clear. If this were a poll, it would be like 99% to 1%. They No one who was viewing this was supportive of the town and saying, yeah, this is perfect. Like he should have definitely been kicked out. No one was doing it. Everyone was like, this is insane. Why are we doing this? The town should not be doing this under any circumstances. Town meetings are just that. They're town meetings. There is nothing. This is me editorializing here, but there is nothing that's happening in the town of Mentz that is so serious that you need to have a sign-in sheet for security purposes. And if there is, you need to have law enforcement there. You don't need a sign-in sheet.
Yeah, I think it's incumbent on the government body to create the situation that allows them to respond to whatever it is that they're worried about. I don't think it's the responsibility of the public to assure the government body that everything is okay, if that makes sense, right? So again, if they're worried about disorderly conduct, then they might station an officer nearby. But the idea that somehow a sign-in sheet would protect against that. I don't know I don't know how this is the mechanism to accomplish what they're trying to do if it's about safety, which then begs the question, what's it really about? Why do elected officials usually want to know who's attending the meetings, right? Because the most common thing an elected official is going to say, here's my completely unscientific statistic. 99% of elected officials who are feeling uncomfortable about their role or a decision they've made or something they've said or subject to critique, the first thing they say is, who's that guy? And they want to know where the criticism is coming from. They want to know who is, making them feel bad. So that in some cases, they can dismiss, minimize, or otherwise ignore the content of the criticism. So I don't know. That's what I feel like if you're doing a sign-in sheet and it's a requirement. Sign-up sheet's a nice thing if you're trying to build community and maybe they're looking to start an email list to communicate with residents after the fact. But a mandatory sign-in sheet to gain entry, to have the privilege of observing a public body deliberate is just not the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah, and you and I are plenty familiar with elected bodies that draw public scrutiny, criticism, fanfare, good, bad, indifferent. I did as much digging as I possibly could, and I realized the town of Mentz is a very small community in what most would probably describe as a news desert, despite some folks making some efforts. I couldn't find anything that even would have warranted the kind of chaos that might require such a move by elected officials. I couldn't find anything. So it genuinely just, I feel like it felt like it came out of nowhere. From what I could gather, the journalist who was at the meeting was asked to attend by some local residents. There wasn't anything that seemed out of the ordinary on any recent agendas, nothing that we haven't seen in countless other communities around the area. And yet we have a town board leveraging a sign-in sheet. It is a very puzzling thing. Are you aware of, I wanted to ask you before we wrap up here, are you aware of any, because the number one question that was coming back after this, after all that debate on social, was what can anybody do? To my knowledge, there isn't any, and that's why I said that at the start of the conversation here. To my knowledge, there isn't anyone that this can be reported to so that there are consequences. Are you aware of any mechanisms or anybody that can be called at the state level?
Well, I mean, the Committee on Open Government can issue these advisory opinions, but like you said, there's not really enforcement until documented cases like this can invalidate board decisions if someone files an Article 78, right? This could be evidence in a future Article
Yeah.
78 proceeding.
And that's yeah, unfortunately, it's so funny. We talk about all the reforms that are necessary. I think maybe the biggest reform that's necessary at the state level is for there to be some sort of actual hearing body where cases of, dare I say, incompetence by elected officials can actually be taken to some sort of ruling body where just actual decisions can be made on whether they acted fairly or not. Because, you mentioned in Article 78, the most run of the mill rudimentary Article 78 is an incredibly expensive process that most people, watching town board meetings in places like Mint simply don't have the resources to pull off.